Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to today's sustainability workshop. I'm very happy to be here to connect with you online from sunny Brussels. My name is Joyce Senwick, and as Louise said, I'm working for the organization Healthcare Within Europe, and I'm going to talk to you about antibiotic supply chains and environmental waste. But before delving into this topic, I wanted to shortly introduce you to my organization that you might not be familiar with. So Healthcare Within Europe is a network of hospitals with members across Europe and partners across the globe. And the goal of organization is to make the healthcare sector more sustainable, but also to mobilize the healthcare sector to drive sustainability in the wider community. Healthcare Without Harm Europe is part of a global organization called Healthcare Without Harm. So we also have offices in Washington, covering the USA, Canada region, and in Manila, in the Philippines, covering Southeast Asia. And we also have a team working across Latin America, and we closely working with strategic partners where we are not present in countries like Australia, China, India, and South Africa, for instance. And in Europe, we are working across four programs: Climate Smart Healthcare, Circular Healthcare, Safer Pharma, which is the program I'm leading, and Sustainable Food. So I've highlighted the three first because I think they are the most relevant to the audience we're having today. So the first one is climate smart healthcare. The goal here is to transform the European healthcare sector into a net zero carbon and climate resilient sector that protects public health from climate change, but also accelerates the transition to a low carbon economy. The second one, circular healthcare, seeks to make sure that European health systems drive markets towards toxic-free products that conserve finite resources, minimize waste, and also contribute to an ethical supply chain and circular economy. And the third program is our Safer Pharma program that I'm coordinating, which seeks to minimize pharmaceutical pollution and its contribution to the development and spread of antimicrobial resistance. So you can see already that all these programs are very much interconnected. We are delivering our work through different action networks. The first one is our membership mechanism, which is our Global Green and Healthy Hospitals Network, or GGHH, that I'm going to speak a bit more in the next slides. We are also engaging through two sustainable healthcare leaders network. One is a network of medical doctors. It's our Doctors for Greener Healthcare network, and the second one is a network of nurses. It's our a climate change nurses network. And we are also working with procurers through our healthcare market transformation network, where we bring basically together experts, academics, and procurers to develop sustainability criteria for specific healthcare products, such as gloves, for instance. So just an additional word on our membership. So I've said that we had mentioned, I said that we had members across Europe, covering the whole WHO European region, and these are hospitals and healthcare systems that are really at the heart of our organization. And there are over 110 members in around 19 countries in Europe. So these members represent over 5,000 hospitals and healthcare facilities. They employ over 1 million people, provides care for more than 89 million people. So this was a short overview of organization, but today the discussion is about antibiotic supply chains and environmental waste. You'll see, however, that in my presentation, I will talk about pharmaceutical pollution more generally, and I will have a focus on antibiotic pollution more specifically, since this is the focus of today's session. But it's difficult to separate both issues. They are very much interconnected, obviously. So let's start with some context. So pharmaceutical pollution is a global issue. More than 770 pharmaceutical substances, either pharmaceutical agents or their metabolites, have been detected in 75 countries all over the world on all continents. And pharmaceuticals in the environment are a global issue because they can act as a driver for the development and spread of antimicrobial resistance, so AMR. They can also have harmful effects on animal and plant life, and they can also have potential effects on human health with pharmaceutical residues found in surface water, in groundwater, and in drinking water in very low concentrations. So these slides shows the main pathways of pharmaceuticals into the environment. And we can see here on the graph that I stole from the OECD publication, Pharmaceutical Residues in Freshwater, published in 2019, that pharmaceuticals can actually enter the environment throughout their life cycle, during the manufacturing stage, during use and excretion, with between 30 and 90% of orally administered pharmaceuticals excreted in the environment through the feces and urine of patients, and in case of inappropriate disposal practices. So basically when patients flush down the meds in the toilets or put them in the sink. So on the graph here, you can see pharmaceutical production at the top. It's really at the start of pharmaceuticals life cycle. Then there's a distinction between veterinary pharmaceuticals that are used in aquaculture, in companion animals, and in livestock. And that can also be reused in manure, slurry, as biosolids, or in wastewater spreading. And the second kind of pharmaceuticals are pharmaceuticals for human use that are used either in households or in hospitals and healthcare facilities that can then reach wastewater and wastewater treatment plants or be disposed as solid waste disposal and also used in landfill or incinerated. And we can see that at all these stages, pharmaceutical residues can actually reach the environment, like in fresh water, like such as surface water and groundwater, but also terrestrial ecosystems. I would like to pause just a second on the first pathway of pharmaceuticals in the environment, which is during manufacturing, because this one aspect which is not much known about, despite many reports highlighting this issue from NGOs and the scientific communities, showing how manufacturing pollution contributes to the issue of pharmaceuticals in the environment, and how huge concentrations of pharmaceutical residues have been found in manufacturing wastewater, which in some cases is really worrying in terms of development of antimicrobial resistance. So in the slide before, we've seen how pharmaceuticals could enter the environment through the urine and feces of patients during the excretion stage. But we saw also on the graph that most of these wastewater were arriving in wastewater treatment plants. However, they're still entering the environment, and that's because wastewater treatment plants are primarily designed to eliminate biodegradable substances, which means they have varying capacity to eliminate pharmaceutical residues. And the problem is that they often have a low removal efficiency for most of these pharmaceutical residues. And in addition, wastewater treatment plants do not capture diffuse sources of pharmaceutical pollution, such as runoff from agriculture, for instance. So I've highlighted here 4 therapeutic classes of particular concern. The first one is anti-inflammatory drugs and sedatives that obviously are used in huge quantities, that can, for example, have negative impacts on animal health, such as causing renal failure in birds, such as in vulture populations. Cytostatics, so anti-cancer drugs that are toxic by design to living cells. The third class is synthetic hormones that can act as endocrine disruptors. They can have, for example, a negative impact on the reproduction of fish. And the fourth class is antibiotics, because obviously they can act as a driver for the development and spread of antimicrobial resistance in the environment. So this is obviously my next slide. I guess you are all familiar with that. That antimicrobial resistance is obviously a huge health and development threat. It has been as highlighted by the WHO as one of the 10 biggest health threats facing humanity. A new report has been published in the Lancet earlier this year showing that antimicrobial resistance was now causing the direct death of 1.27 billion people per year globally, including 33,000 in Europe, and that already almost 40% of drug-resistant infections are due to bacteria resistant to last resort antibiotics, which is obviously very worrying. And if no effective action is taken, antimicrobial resistance could, by 2050, cause the death of 10 million people per year globally, including 390,000 in Europe. And the two most affected regions would be Africa and Asia, which means that AMR by 2050 could potentially kill as many people as all forms of cancers combined. So that's why in 2017, UN Environment, or UNEP, has identified growing antimicrobial resistance linked to the discharge of drugs and particular chemicals into the environment as one of the most worrying health threats we are facing today. And a new report on the environmental dimensions of antimicrobial resistance has been also recently published by UN Environment. And this report identifies the main pollutant sources that contribute to the development and transmission of AMR in the environment. And these sources are poor sanitation, sewage and waste effluent and waste from pharmaceutical manufacturing, which I have already highlighted just before, effluent and waste from healthcare facilities, use of antimicrobials and manure in crop production, and releases effluents and waste in animal production. There has also been a very interesting project called Global Monitoring of Pharmaceuticals Project, which was led by the University of York in the UK. And these projects monitored over 1,000 sampling sites along 258 rivers in over 100 countries all over the world. And these projects observed the highest cumulative active pharmaceutical ingredients concentrations in sub-Saharan Africa, South Africa, and South America. And these highest concentrations were in areas associated with poor wastewater and waste management infrastructure and pharmaceutical manufacturing. And the most frequently detected active pharmaceutical ingredients that were detected in more than half of the sites monitored were carbamazepine, which is a drug used to treat epilepsy and nerve pain, metformin, which is used against type 2 diabetes, and caffeine, but obviously caffeine also comes from lifestyle use. What is really worrying from the results of this project is that concentrations of at least one active pharmaceutical ingredient were above levels considered safe for aquatic organisms or of concerns in terms of selection for antimicrobial resistance at a quarter of monitored sites. And I also highlighted the 5 most detected antibiotics because of the focus of today's session, which were trimethoprim, sulfamethoxazole, ciprofloxacin, metronidazole, and clarithromycin. And I've put here the link to the final report of this project that was released early last year and which made some headlines in the press, especially in the UK actually, but I've highlighted here two from CNN and National Geographic. So I've pictured here kind of a gloomy landscape of what pharmaceutical pollution is. The good news is that there are solutions to address and reduce pharmaceutical pollution. So I've tried to be solutions oriented and to put forward some potential solutions here in the next part of my presentation. So because pharmaceutical pollution can occur across the life cycle of pharmaceuticals, there is a crucial need for a multi-stakeholder approach to addressing this issue. So we need to involve intergovernmental organizations with bodies like UN Environment, the UN, WHO, but also SAICM and other international fora. National governments, regulatory agencies, and authorities that are best placed to provide the right regulatory framework to reduce pharmaceutical pollution. the pharmaceutical industry, obviously, healthcare professionals and procurers, patients that are using the drugs, but also veterinarians and food producers in relation to veterinary medicinal products, wastewater treatment plant operators, drinking water utilities, and civil society organizations like mine. Specifically in relation to AMR, there has been a recent call to action by the global leaders groups on AMR, which brings together a series of high-level ministers, sometimes prime ministers from different countries that really want to address this issue at a global level. And this call to action specifically look at reducing antimicrobial discharges from food systems, manufacturing facilities, and human health systems into the environment. And therefore, recommendations are to strengthen governance and oversight, to improve surveillance and data availability, to improve discharge management, and to promote research and development. I know that many people in the audience are actually medical doctors, so I've decided to put a few slides at what medical doctors in particular could do to tackle pharmaceutical pollution and antimicrobial pollution more specifically. And the first thing I think is to adopt a series of easy practices that can really help reduce emissions and waste. And these are prescribing smaller starter packs for new medicines, prescribing the smallest package possible, giving refills as needed, prescribing preventative measures and non-medical therapy where possible, prescribing pharmaceuticals and particularly antibiotics only when needed. As you know, in the OECD, up to 50% of all antimicrobial consumption in human healthcare might be inappropriate. So there is really a big window for action here. Using rapid point-of-care diagnostics in both primary and secondary care to support clinical decision-making and advising on alternative approaches such as vaccination to prevent infections. Medical doctors can also educate patients to let them know that they should only buy over-the-counter medicines when needed and avoid stockpiling medicines that cannot be used before expiry, to never dispose of unused pharmaceuticals in the toilet or sink, and to always use safe, locally recommended methods for disposing of pharmaceuticals and packaging. And for unused or expired drugs, in most countries, this means bringing these drugs back to the pharmacy. But medical doctors can also engage with healthcare leaders. They can leverage their trusted voices to advocate for a change in procurement and prescription practices to ensure that sustainability criteria are considered in purchasing decisions and in developing formularies. We have developed a short animated video about this topic. This summarizes everything I've said before and put forward some recommendation to medical doctors. It is freely available online on the YouTube platform, and the video also has French and German subtitles in case you'd like to share this around in your network. If you'd like to know more about the work that Healthcare Harm Europe is doing in relation to pharmaceuticals in the environment and antimicrobial resistance in the environment, you can check the Safer Pharma resource page on our main website, noharm-europe.org, or our website specifically dedicated to pharmaceuticals in the environment, pharmaenvironment.org. And this website also includes a database of best practices that have been developed by different countries or by different regions all across Europe. I think that's all for me.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Philip Howard. I'm the Vice President of the British Society of Antimicrobial Chemotherapy. Thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk to you today. So I'd like to talk to you about how learned societies can be a powerful advocate for change, and how we can drive sustainability by improving antibiotic use at a One Health level. The recent G7 Climate Environmental Ministers communique was probably one of the first times that we'd seen climate change and antimicrobial resistance being brought together. And as part of their communique, they talked about preventing, combating zoonoses and antimicrobial resistance using a One Health approach. And they said that we would underline the importance of a One Health approach in tackling antimicrobial resistance and call on all governments to promptly implement measures for the sound management and reduction of inappropriate use of antimicrobials. So whilst there's been evidence linking vector and waterborne infections to climate has been well established, but there's been new evidence emerging about antimicrobial resistance being directly linked to climate change. Beneath us is some information from a couple of studies that have taken place, one from the USA using data between 2013 and 2015, and another one from Europe using data from the years 2000 up until 2016. And what they've tried to do here is look at differences in temperatures and look at the increase on antimicrobial resistance while taking into account any changes in consumption of antimicrobials. So first of all, if we look at E. coli, they showed that over the time periods there was a 4.2% increase in resistance within E. coli in the USA, and a 0.33% per year increase within the EU. Within Klebsiella pneumoniae, which is often one of the more probable bugs for resistance, again 2.2% increase in resistance per every 10-degree increase in temperature, and then probably more startlingly a 1.2% per year rise within the EU. And then finally, Staphylococcus aureus. There was a rise in the USA of the temperature changes of plus 2.7%. But interestingly, within Europe, there was actually a decrease in resistance by 0.4% per year. Now, the WHO and United Nations, others, have been looking at ways in which antimicrobial resistance disrupts the Sustainable Development Goals across the world. And if we look at this diagram on the left-hand side, we know that antimicrobial resistance could push an additional 24 million people into extreme poverty by 2030. There'll be an impact on zero hunger. We would see livestock production in low-income countries would be affected the most. And at its worst situation, there would be a reduction of 7% within productivity by the year 2030. And animal protein plays an important role in nutrition for children and women. On the back of that, we would also see an impact on good health and well-being. We know that effective antibiotics are needed to treat infections, and antimicrobial resistance puts patients treating cancer, also those recovering from major surgery or diabetic feet, at risk of life-threatening infections. Then we'd also see an impact on the decent work and economic growth, and we know that AMR can impact on the global GDP, and it could be as large as the 2008-9 global financial crisis, which amounted to losses of $3.4 trillion, potentially this by the year 2030. And overall, that leads to reduced inequality. And we know there'll be huge differences between the low and middle income countries with the high income countries on there. So for the first time, we've seen an STG framework indicator for AMR, and they are reporting on bloodstream infections that are resistant to methicillin, so what percentage are MRSA, and also those which E. coli bloodstream infections are resistant to third-generation cephalosporins. And the graph here on the right-hand side shows a huge difference between low and middle income countries and the range of resistance in E. coli compared to the high income countries. Personally, I think it's time for us to start linking antimicrobial resistance to the 13th Sustainable Development Goal, which is climate action. So why do I think this? Well, food animal production is a larger producer of greenhouse gases, but it's also a large consumer of antimicrobials. We know there are 88 billion or more animals. Land animals are bred, reared and slaughtered for food globally each year. The percentage of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions from animal agriculture is anywhere between 14.5% to 16.5%, and this is very similar to emissions from all global transportation. And then by the year 2030, the livestock sector is projected to account for almost half of the world's emissions budget for the 1.5 degree sea rise unless things change. And at the moment, 75% of antibiotics are being used in farm animals within USA. Within the European Union, have tighter rules on the use of antibiotics in animals. It's 70%, and within the UK, it's down to 45%. So we know antimicrobial consumption is growing. On the left-hand side here is the graph from a paper by Klein that showed that antimicrobial consumption per 1,000 inhabitants per day is fairly static within high-income countries, but it's certainly growing from the years 2000, 2015, especially in the upper middle income countries, but also in the lower middle income countries. We know that there's been a 65% rise in human antibiotic consumption, as we've seen on the graph on the left, from the year 2000 to 2015, and it's expected to double by 2030. There's a 67% rise in animal antibiotic consumption predicted by 2030 as well. And as far as countries with controls on antibiotic use in humans go and animals, it's 89% within humans, so pretty good, but only 55% within animals. So more work's needed here. And just to remind you all that because of the systems in place, no antibiotics remain in meat at the point of sale, as the slaughter is often delayed to allow clearance of the antibiotics, as you can see from the diagram below. So the reason I think a One Health approach is important for antimicrobial resistance is this. So there is some data that shows that reducing antimicrobial consumption in animals results in a smaller but still convincing body of evidence for a 24% absolute reduction in antibiotic resistant bacteria in humans. And the greatest reduction actually seen in people who had direct contact with livestock than those that didn't. And that came from the TAN 2017 Lancet paper, which was looking at restricting antibiotic food producing animals. So the United Nations Independent Panel of Evidence on Action Against Antimicrobial Resistance came up with some draft terms of reference for consultation. And one of the bits they were after was trying to provide evidence-based practical options for mitigation, containment and interventions, including on local knowledge. And one of the things that BSAC wanted to respond, or did respond to this, was about one radical but ultimately very practical way to address the challenges in all setting would be to create a single global measurement for antibiotic consumption. And a first attempt at this has already been made through the creation of the Antibiotic Footprint Initiative, which BSAC has helped to lead. And I'll take you through this. So this is a conceptual figure for the carbon footprint and antibiotic footprint. And so you can see the carbon footprints made up from sort of fuel, transportation, fires, deforestation. There's elements of recycling that fit into this. And then in terms of the antibiotic footprint, it's defined as the total amount of antibiotic consumption associated with human activities, including either the direct consumption of antibiotics by humans at a community and hospital level, and also consumption by animals. And these can be either animals that are eaten or those that are kept as pets. And you can read the paper in Journal of Antimicrobial Chemotherapy. Now, this concept of an antibiotic footprint has actually been used as part of one of the government's reports on the improvements we've shown within One Health within the United Kingdom. So you can see on the top left hand here is a breakdown as percentages, and this is consumption of antibiotics in tons. you can see people accounted for 55%, which was just over 500 tonnes. Animals, 38%, 368 tonnes on there. And then companion animals and horses for a very small amount. But by 2017, we'd seen some real improvements. Mainly, we'd seen the improvements within the animal sector, and you can see on the bar charts at the bottom here, big reduction in animals, 35% reduction between 2013 and 2017, 6% within people, and overall that was a 19% reduction. So what does that actually turn into in terms of an antibiotic footprint? Well, in 2015, it was 14.3 grams per person in a year. And then by 2017, for some of this data, it shrunk down to an antibiotic footprint of 11.7 grams per person by then. And there has been some targets that have been set within the UK AMR National Action Plan for reducing antibiotics in animal use, and which was a 25% reduction from 2016 to 2018, and then to review it. And without any incentives or other initiatives other than self-regulation, the animal sector has done really well. So this is from the website, the antibioticfootprint.net, and what it's done is taken from freely available data that's published and either submitted to WHO or elsewhere, ECDC, and on the left-hand side, you can see the amount of antibiotics in tonnes consumed in the community. And on the right-hand side, you can see the amount consumed in hospitals. And not surprisingly, it's smaller. And as you would expect, probably the larger countries have larger amounts of antibiotics consumed. So when we start to look at antibiotic use in humans, as shown here on the left-hand side, and many countries can only report their consumption as combined total use of antibiotics in humans, and on the right-hand side, the use in agriculture. And you can see on here, there is some really big usage from some of the larger countries, Turkey, Iran, Japan. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the amount used in agriculture. And you'll see the USA, which is got a really large population. But it uses an awful lot of antibiotics in agriculture. We'll come back to that later. So as we were talking about antibiotic footprint, if you actually add all of these together, then you come up with grams per person. Now, I will have to point out here that the lighter colours where there's incomplete data. So, for example, the USA looks like it has a smaller footprint than, say, Italy, but this is only data from the agricultural side and not from the human side. So the darker colours you should really look at to make a comparison on here. And you can see countries like Spain have a really large footprint of 72.6 grams per person, say compared to the UK of 14.3. So Derek Lamathowell, who pulled this together, has then done some further work on trying to allow you to trace your antibiotic footprint at an individual level. And I'll just take you through some examples of the footprint that he's done. So they ask you some information about what country you come from, which era you in. So I was in the baby boomers, male. Ask you some questions about when you last took antibiotics. And if you answer a question about antibiotics, how many courses you've had within that period of time and how many days you took it for. It also asks you a bit about your meat consumption compared to the average in your country. And in our household, we're not particularly big meat eaters. And it's estimated that we eat the equivalent of 3.3 sausages per day in the UK. So I eat slightly less than that. And then it asks you a question about, have you ever read the labels and information about the antibiotics before buying any meat? So before I go on to that, I'll just come up with the answers. So this is at the top here. This is the British me, and I've not taken any antibiotics in the last year, and then I probably have about 1.53 grams per year from my meat consumption, which is probably less than others. So this is antibiotics from my meat consumption. But my alter ego, which I put in, who lives in the USA, he particularly likes his steaks, and he's had 3 courses of antibiotics in the last year, but he doesn't bother taking the full course, and he takes them until he starts to feel better. So it only takes about 3 days on average. And this is my alter ego's footprint on here. You can see the amount of antibiotics that I take per year is 9.8 grams per year, and then the amount of antibiotics I get from my meat consumption is 32 grams a year. So overall, my footprint for my USA alter ego is 42.5 grams per year. So a really big difference. And this, you can see how it compares to the average from other countries within Europe. So you can see Estonia, which is very low, going to Netherlands slightly higher, then Australia, and then I've got me, and then my alter ego, me from the USA, which is much larger. And then if you look around, it's plotted on other people. So these are individuals. You can look at countries. So this is me just here at the top right. Look like a fairly small amount of antibiotics I get from taking them or from eating meat, compared to some other people who've completed it in Spain that I brought up, for instance, or the USA, which is much larger. The other thing which I wanted to really bring up and highlight to you is label confusing, and the UK has tried to come up with a simpler approach. You may see things that say it's antibiotic free or organic on labels. What does that mean? All food is antibiotic free at the point of the animal being slaughtered, and but one of the things that is important is there are very strict rules for what organic means. The other thing is about being raised without antibiotics or no antibiotics ever. Animals get ill just like humans do, and they need antibiotics. So what happens to these animals that need antibiotics? Are they just killed when they're ill, or are they just put out to pasture elsewhere? And then there's other initiatives that people have said about actually having something on the label about this antibiotic contained so many milligrams during its rearing. And I think it's going to be quite confusing on here. And the most important thing within the UK is that good animal welfare is key. And so one of the things that we'd recommend within the UK is this red tractor mark. And this is all around focusing on good animal husbandry. And what they try to do is make sure that the highest priority clinically important antibiotics, such as colistin, fluoroquinolones, 3rd or 4th generation cephalosporins, are only used as last resort under vet direction. And it needs to be guided by sensitivity or diagnostic testing. And as part of this scheme, farms are required to collate their annual medicines use and discuss the use with their vet. So I'd recommend this and say to you, go and look at the rumour sign. The other thing that learned societies can do is get to pull influencers together. And so this was a conference that we ran a couple of years ago, pulling together some investors, European Bank for Reconstruction Development, working with the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, which was looking at the risk and identifying the opportunities for global investment, but also looking about use of animals in food production. Within the USA, they've really been trying to tackle hard some of the issues about antibiotics used in their food chain. And certainly the investors have been doing a lot of work with actually putting pressure onto some of the food producers. And there are reports showing you around the how some of the large food retailers perform around their use of antimicrobials in food production. And they've given them grade and colour ratings as shown on here. So I say go and look at the chain reaction reports that come out most years. And they highlight where they're using the medically important antimicrobials within the USA. And you can see the bulk are in cattle, pigs, turkey, and other poultry. One place where there's been a really good improvement, and this has really been on the back of the global investors have been helping to drive some of the food producers to set timelines to reduce unnecessary antibiotic use in food animal production. And I'd say go and have a look at the FAIR initiative, which is looking at antimicrobial resistance, and they've made some really good progress with the likes of Burger King, KFC, McDonald's, who've come up with their commitments. So moving back to home then, what other things can we do to influence the better use of antibiotics? Well, one of the things that's really important is ensuring that our MPs are briefed on key issues that impact on their constituents. And so the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Antibiotics, which BSAC serves Secretariat, pulls together different areas for discussion to help briefing of MPs so they can ask pertinent questions within the House and make sure that antimicrobial resistance and linked to climate change remains on their radar. And so this will include things like antibiotic residues in sewage and agricultural runoff, and that was around the time of the Environment Bill, getting together pharmacists, dentists, GPs, talk about what they can do to contain and control AMR in the UK. And then looking at areas such as vaccines to tackle drug-resistant infections and various areas of opportunities. So really trying to promote some investment. And then the final thing is really about working with communities where there is higher rates of resistance and anticipated huge problems in the future with resistance. And this is something that we've pulled together called Stop Superbugs, which we think of as a global emergency, and we support up to 5 community-based projects globally to improve antibiotic use. And these are just a couple of them around in Tanzania, which is Rollback Antibiotic Resistance Initiative, which is working with having up school clubs, so trying to influence the young. And then within India, Superheroes Against Super Drugs, again, inspirational project run by volunteers team. We're in Hyderabad, again, educating young people about super drugs. So in summary then, I think learned societies can drive sustainability. I think there's a key role in working with investors, promoting good practice developed by others, briefing parliamentarians, providing free education to citizens and healthcare professionals, and ideally, especially for those in low middle income countries, to provide pre-membership wherever possible. Thank you very much.
Right, so I'm going to start the talk unusually by contradicting the chair. So I don't feel like I'm an expert in sustainability and antibiotic use, but I think without being an expert, you can still be a powerful advocate for change. And I've taken on leading the sustainability portfolio within the antimicrobial prescribing and meds optimisation team in the AMR programme at NHS England and Improvements. And I'm on a very steep learning curve, but I'm here today to sort of talk to you a bit about what we're doing and what you can do potentially as well. So what's happening at the top within the NHS policy? Take you through these. So you may have heard about the overprescribing review, and a key appointment in that was Professor Tony Avery, a GP in Nottingham, who is leading the sort of prescribing optimisation review with the aim of reducing the use of medicines where there are better alternatives or they're of limited benefit. So that's something that's very overarching. And in some ways, we've got a bit of a head start on that within antibiotic use because we have the burden of resistance, and that's driven changes in prescribing. And for us to start using fewer antibiotics where they're of limited benefit. So we're slightly ahead of the game, and the review does talk about that in there, but a lot of that is aimed on long-term, managing long-term conditions rather than acute conditions as the focus. We use about 1.1 billion items of medicines are dispensed in primary care in the UK every year. And the review estimated that about 10% of those might not be needed. So obviously that's great for sustainability in terms of reducing the use of things with lower benefits, and part of it talks about using things like social prescribing instead. So there's a lot to be done there. The other really key document is the delivering a net zero, so the NHS plan. The NHS has gone a lot further than healthcare in other countries in terms of actually setting out, calculating the carbon footprints and putting in place measures to reduce that. So there's a lot within that document that's really useful reading if this is relatively new to you. These are a couple of images from that document, and we see from this that medicines make about 25% of the NHS's carbon footprint. So you see the 20% in medicines and chemicals, and then there's another 5% in the anaesthetic gases and metered doses inhalers, which is carbon footprint at the point of use associated with those sort of gas propellants or the anaesthetic gases. So a lot of medicines optimisation around sustainability in the NHS is focused at the moment on inhalers and anaesthetic gases, just because that's a very large area. But that doesn't mean that there's not work to do in other avenues, and that's part of why I'm talking to you today and why we're looking at this as a key sort of portfolio within our antimicrobial resistance programme at NHS England and improvements. Obviously medicines make up a different proportion, so in primary care you can see in the blue sort of bit in the middle, medicines make up a much bigger sort of proportion of their carbon footprint, if you like, and less so in hospital, where there are other things like the building energies that take up and medical equipment that take up a lot of their carbon footprints. But you can see they're still really important parts of the NHS carbon footprint in both sectors. And these are more that sort of infographics from that net zero document, and it may not project very well, but it's sort of giving you, the graph on the left is giving you all the different interventions that we're putting in place over the years to reduce the NHS to a carbon zero sort of service. At the moment, as I've said, there's the inhalers and anaesthetic gases work, but there's a lot about getting suppliers to align with this NHS net zero commitment. So the issue at the moment when I look at how to optimise antibiotic use for sustainability is there's almost no estimates of what your carbon footprint of individual medicines are. So it's really difficult to compare like for like and work out what the best environmentally responsible use of medicines is, because we don't yet have the data. But I think part of this drive to move all our suppliers onto the NHS commitments will get more information as they move towards that and as we engage with them, and that is happening at the top. And then I think we will reach the point down the line where we'll be able to look at cost efficacy, evidence base for medicines use. We'll be able to also look at the environmental footprint of medicines use and feed that into guidelines and the evidence base as well. So I think we will get there eventually. Obviously with antimicrobial use, we've got the antimicrobial resistance burden as well to add in. So it'll be quite a complex matrix of thinking about what the best use of antibiotics is, and I think we'll get more information of that down the line. I do want to say that the NHS accounts for about 4% of the nation's carbon emissions, so in terms of bringing the environmental footprint down to a zero carbon emissions, it is going to be a significant change and a significant reduction in our overall national carbon footprint. And the 4% is fairly similar to the airline industry. So we're all working in an environment that is actually fairly uses a lot of resource. So we do need to think about what we're using. So in terms of trying to think, and this is something I've been trying to think about, and as I said, the evidence isn't out there to draw real conclusions, which as a pharmacist I found quite difficult. I like to look at the evidence base and work out what I need to do. And I think we will get there and we will get better evidence, particularly if we as pharmacists, doctors, nurses, etc. champion for that. But I also think we're slightly ahead of the game in that antimicrobial resistance has forced us to look at our prescribing and use of antibiotics in a way that perhaps other sectors of healthcare haven't, and other types of medicines, because we've had this pressure of antibiotic resistance and these efforts to reduce antibiotic use and to stop using antibiotics where they're of minimal benefit. So the top left-hand side is an infographic from the SBAR report, which has just shown you this decline in use of antibiotics, and that's in DDDs, so defined daily doses per 1,000 inhabitants per day. On the right-hand side, the top graph is the reductions in primary care, and that's sort of NHS business authorities data. So we've reduced massively. The blue line shows that coming down below the sort of threshold that was set as part of the National Action Plan for 5 years reduction in antibiotics. We've done slightly less well in terms of secondary care in reducing antibiotic use. And when we look at antibiotics as a proportion of sort of total medicines, we know that medicines account for 25%, and antibiotics will come within that 20% that don't have a specific carbon footprint at point of use, but it's also tied up in manufacture and transport of these medicines. I was trying to work out how much of the sort of medicines footprint is made up of antibiotics, and I used the open prescribing data to look at in primary care, and about 2.5% of all items dispensed are antibiotics, and obviously that most of the other drugs are used for long-term conditions, so there might be supply of larger amounts at a time. So I couldn't exactly say that 2.5% of all medicines are antibiotics in primary care. It's probably a little bit less, but that was the best guess I could make. And I used the defined data to look at secondary care, and that 3.4% of all defined daily doses of medicines within hospitals was antibiotics, so a slightly higher measure in secondary care. Just a nice slide that sort of shows in terms of where the carbon footprint is, and obviously medicines and pharmaceuticals seem to be much higher yield in primary care. So we use more medicines in primary care, and they have fewer sort of other carbon sort of intensive practices like heating buildings and medical equipment, etc. there. So medicines is probably a bit more important in primary care as being a higher sort of carbon burden. This is a slide I quite like in terms of thinking about what we can do to make healthcare more sustainable, and this is from the Royal College of Physicians, and I use this to sort of think about how we can make antibiotics more sustainable. So there's lots of things we can do and are doing. We can reduce demand for antibiotics, promote self-care more. We can limit prescribing where there's less benefit, thinking about optimising durations. Again, place of care is probably really important. We've seen in previous slides how big the sort of burden is in terms of carbon footprints of treating patients in hospitals, whereas out of hospitals and getting them out early will be beneficial. Vaccination and preventing infections, so IPC activities, getting surgical prophylaxis and SSI prevention will be important. Penicillin allergy delabeling I'll talk about a bit as well. And then there's the last thing in terms of low carbon alternatives. So IV drugs are without doubt higher carbon than oral alternatives. So IV to oral switch, environmental sustainability is a real driver for that, and there are some other things that we can do to look at low carbon alternatives there, which I'll talk about. So there's lots of stuff around antibiotic use in terms of reducing use where benefit is minimal, and that's supported by guidelines. There's loads of nice guidelines about where to offer and where not to offer antibiotics. There's the target resources that can help you implement those guidelines. There's lots of incentives and levers that we're working through with the AMR programme. So we're promoting reduction in prescribing, reduction of broad spectrum antibiotics within the standard contract in secondary care. And there's loads of data. So the last two images are from the Futures NHS site, and there's an AMR work stream within that, and it's really useful. You can join that work stream and get links to all these data resources that can tell you about prescribing in your local area, and where you might be a high user of drugs, and there might be areas for optimization which will help with sustainability. This is something that we've got data from quite recently. So this is looking at the proportion of amoxicillin in primary care that is given as a 5-day course, so a 15 quantity in grey, 21 capsules, so blue, in the blue colour, and then other durations is the small amount at the top. And actually, if we just shifted 10% of prescriptions from the 7-day course to the 5-day course, we'd say 14 million capsules a year. And so significant savings just by shortening that. And there now is a pack of amoxicillin that comes as a 15, so it's quite easy to do. For those of you working in hospital, there'll be areas you can look at this. So you walk-in centres, urgent treatment centres, ED prescribing, outpatient prescribing. And you'll find that the majority of things you prescribe amoxicillin for, so when you look at the NICE guidance, 5 days is recommended for most things. So cough, acute otitis media, exacerbation of COPD and community-acquired pneumonia, and the lower curve scores all recommend 5 days. It's only infective exacerbations of bronchiectasis where you can use amoxicillin that they recommend longer durations. So that really is quite a quick win. There's also reducing durations in secondary care and in sort of more difficult to treat infections, and that's my resource, my usual sort of go-to for the evidence base around that, Brad Spellberg's website. I think IV to oral switch is really important, and again, this is something we're looking at within the AMR programme and optimising this. Just the sheer amount of plastic giving IVs instead of orals, it is overwhelming. And obviously you think about manufacturing and transporting drugs as well, or to have way lower impact. And this is a graph from Define just showing the variation in different hospitals in terms of IV versus oral use. So the orange is oral, and this is percentage of DDDs oral versus IV. So there's huge differences. So potential areas for optimization there. We also need to think about what's the most, if we have to use IV, what might the most environmentally sustainability sort of method of doing that might be. And here, for example, is just showing the sort of impact of giving dalbavancin versus ticaplanin in terms of what volume of resource you use. I think there's also a lot about how we monitor antibiotics. Again, there's not any data on this, so I couldn't really tell you how much carbon we could save by optimizing antibiotics, but antibiotic TDM and monitoring. But I think there's those of you who work in secondary care will know that we overorder tests a lot, and there's probably a lot of quality improvement work we could do to reduce blood sampling and make this process much greener. Place of care is really important, and one of our work streams is optimising OPAC care. So inpatient bed care creates a lot higher carbon footprint than either outpatient appointments at the hospital or the GP. And different models of OPAT will have different carbon footprints. So self-administering, lower than going into an infusion centre in a hospital, and not forgetting that even in OPAT we need to consider oral switches. We can, I'm just going to whiz through this because I think we're short on time, but avoiding admission. So things you can do to avoid infection and avoid admission with infection will really be sustainable. So this is just looking at the Right Care UTI Focus Pack and looking at potential for looking at quality of care with UTIs and preventing readmissions, and it can tell you whether your area has a high rate of admissions and a potential opportunity. And then I think we mentioned in the previous talks that prevention is usually more sustainable than cure. So everything we're doing in IPC and AMS to prevent further infections is going to be sustainable. Penicillin allergy delabeling. So we know patients with penicillin allergy labels receive less optimal treatment, and they have worse outcomes compared to patients without that label. So anybody we can delabel, you're reducing the risk of further morbidity and mortality, which is sustainable. So we're working on getting these services up and running as standard. Safe disposal of antibiotics, I think the first talk really showed what the problems are with that, and this is just an example of some work in the Midlands last year, where they ran an antibiotic amnesty as part of Antibiotic Awareness Week, and they really promoted this on Twitter, posters, local press, etc. And they got 500 full or part packs of antibiotics returned over a 2-week period. So that's a huge amount of antibiotics just in one region that came back to pharmacies for proper disposal rather than end up in the wastewater. So in summary, that's a short whip through, but stewardship is intrinsically linked to the Greener NHS initiative. I think we've been trying to reduce unnecessary use for a long time, and sustainability is sort of a new lever to do that as well. So it might help engage more people than we've previously been able to, and it's a new tool to use. And I think there's, as I've said, there's not great evidence about what's best, but while we wait for that evidence and wait to learn more about the carbon footprint associated with all the different treatment options, I think we can create positive change with these sort of pragmatic common sense approaches. But obviously there's a lot of work to do, and we ourselves need to drive change. So everybody out there who practices, you know, think about what you're going to do in terms of all the information you get at this day and how you're going to take that forward, and start with a small change like Greta Thunberg in terms of her school strike. Other organisations that might be helpful, the Sustainability in QI is a nice resource to start embedding that. And I've been following Pharmacy Declares, and they have loads of useful information.